Don't bring me back. Don't bring me, don't.
Hello ladies and gentle frogs, Prof Toast here, and today we're going to be talking about the rise and fall of Sega. So before I get started, I do want to apologize ahead of time. This video was actually meant to be out sooner, but due to a bunch of delays that kept happening, I basically barely got a chance to actually get this fully typed out and, well, not really fully ready. Because basically I haven't had a chance to proofread this, so if I happen to kind of pause or stutter here and there, my apologies. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the rise. In 1984, Standard Games began operation in Honolulu, Hawaii by Marty Granley to provide coin-operated machines such as jukeboxes and slots. After 12 years in the business, the United States banned slot machines, so he picked up his business and moved to Japan with the new name of Service Games. Around the same time, David Rosen, who was stationed in Japan during the Korean War, started Rosen Enterprises. His company was also in the business of importing amusement machines to Japan. So in 1964, the two companies merged to create Sega. The name came from the first two letters of Service and Games. 2 years after the merger, they started creating their own original machine, Periscope, which is a light and sound game, which at the time created an immersive gaming experience. The game was so successful, the game shipped to the US, making Sega an international company. Not long after that point, they sold their business to Gulf and Western, with Rosen still at the board of the company. With the 1970s came the rise of the video games, and Sega wanted in on the action, so they bought Gremlin Industries so that they could design and produce the game Head On. In Head On, you were a car trying to collect as many dots as possible without getting hit by the other vehicle. To continue their success in the game market, they developed 3D games such as Turbo and Buck Rogers and A Planet of Zoom. With these hits that revolutionized the industry, Sega was doing well. Unfortunately, when the game industry crashed in 1983, many of Sega's benefactors wanted out. With the video game industry hurting, Sega and Nintendo both saw this as an opportunity to bring it back to life with next-generation game systems, so the race was on. Sega began to work on the Sega SG-1000, which was released in Japan about the same time as the Famicom. For those of you who don't know what the Famicom is, basically what the NES is here in America. Alright, so they basically released them both for the SG-1000 for the same price as the Famicom. Sadly for the SG-1000, it didn't do very well, mainly because of how similar it was to the ColecoVision, and the system didn't bring much of anything new to the table. With the market still not doing its best, Gulf and Western offered to sell Sega back to Rosen for $38 million. Knowing this company had a bright future, he assembled a group of bankers to buy the company back. For CEO, they picked Hayao Nakayama, who had previously been the vice president of distribution. With this new leadership, Sega continued on to the next venture. Sega continued to push their game systems with two updated consoles, the SG-1000 Mark II and the SC-3000. Even though these systems didn't take off, it helped them learn the market. By 1985, they realized they couldn't take a market share away from Nintendo with an inferior machine, so they created the SG-1000 Mark III, which would later be called the Sega Master System in the US. Even though they had superior hardware, the system did miserably in Japan. But they didn't want to make the same mistake in North America, so following Nintendo's model, they released their system with a light gun and multiple games to make it more appealing. Sega was having success in the arcade market with games such as Wonder Boy, Space Harrier, and Fantasy Zone. With these successes in the arcade, they went straight to work on porting them to the home console. Realizing that they needed a mascot, Sega went on to make Alex the Kid in Miracle World to compete with Super Mario Bros. The system also had 3D glasses that used new technology to create an impressive effect, but even with Sega's noteworthy efforts, Nintendo had 90% of the market share in North America by 1987. Sega's biggest problem at this time was not getting third-party support, since Nintendo basically had a monopoly on the market. Third-party developers had to follow their rules, so if the company even thought of creating a game on the Master System, Nintendo would cut them off right away. Even though the Master System did better in the European and South American market, that did them no good since those markets weren't as influential as the US and Japan. By the end of the 1980s, Nintendo had almost full dominance over the US market, but Sega saw this as a new opportunity to make a next-gen system before Nintendo. Using a 16-bit hardware, they put together the Sega Mega Drive. This system didn't fare so well since the new Super Mario Bros. 3 released a week before the new system, but that didn't stop them from selling 400,000 units for the first year. In the summer of 1989, they released their new system in the US with the name of Genesis. Their system came bundled with the game Altered Beast, which was a port of an arcade beat-em-up. Sega needed a person to get the Genesis off the ground when they chose Michael Katz to be the president of Sega America. Mr. Katz had a lot of experience working in the industry with television and ColecoVision. He was a true veteran to the industry. Sega's biggest problem was third-party support, since Nintendo won't let devs put their titles on any other game system. Katz decided to license celebrities such as Joe Montana, Tommy Lazzardo, and Michael Jackson. With these new games based off celebrities, Sega came up with a slogan, "Genesis does when Nintendo don't." They also needed a new mascot, so they tossed around dozens of ideas when they settled with a blue hedgehog known as Sonic. While the Genesis was doing okay in the US, Japan wasn't impressed, so they fired Katz and brought in Tom Polinsky. When Tom became acquainted with Sega's problems, he made a game plan. He thought that they should they should drop pricing of the console and stop marketing as a home arcade, and also bundle it with the game Sonic the Hedgehog. When they pitched this idea, Sega of Japan, they were skeptical. They thought that bundling their best game and dropping the price of the system would lose them money. But they had faith in Tom, so they let him do everything he wanted. Around the same time, Sega released the Game Gear, which was a handheld system that competed with Nintendo's Game Boy. It was a superior system in the sense that the games were in color, but on the downside, the battery life was very short. With big retailers only used to selling Nintendo games, places like Walmart and Target refused to sell Genesis, so Sega had to be inventive. To get everyone selling their product, they would have to get the biggest store on board, which was Walmart. To convince Walmart they should sell Genesis, they went to Bentonville, Arkansas, where the headquarters are located, and Sega advertised like crazy. They rented space at the local mall near Walmart to show off all the cool Genesis games, bought out all the local billboards, played commercials non-stop on the radio, and bought a space at the local college's football field. After a few months of this, Walmart agreed to sell their system as long as they would stop the ads. Third-party support came easier to secure once stores started selling their system and marketing had customers talking, but it was still a slow process. The Genesis really started to take off in 1991 when Sonic the Hedgehog launched with it as a bundle for $149, while the Super Nintendo was still $199. While the Genesis was doing great in America, it was a completely different story in Japan. The Mega Drive had very little market share, mainly due to them not using the same strategy as Sega America used. Sega was looking for the next big thing. They saw that CDs were the way of the future, so they designed the Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis. While the add-on wasn't the best seller, they did have some pretty cool games, such as Snatcher and Sonic CD. Around this point, the Genesis had more market share than Nintendo, but some unfortunate decisions changed that quickly. And at this point, we're going to be talking about the fall of Sega. Alright, so Sega had to start thinking about their next generation systems, so a team in Japan was assigned to the task What they came up with was a Sega Saturn, which was a VR product which was an expensive and VR product that would be a nightmare for developers to program for. And Tom saw this console, he requested an alternate, so he went to Silicon Graphics for a chipset. While Tom thought it was a great idea, Japan said no. So they continued looking on. So this is hold on. Alright, so Silicon Graphics later on went to help make the Nintendo 64. So later, Tom then went to Sony, who was interested in getting into the video game business. They had the idea about making a joint Sega and Sony console and have all the specs Tom wanted. But once again, Sega of Japan hated the idea, so Sony went on to create the successful PlayStation. So with no other options, Sega began planning the launch of the Saturn. Before the launch of their new system, they also released a 32X add-on for the Genesis. This was a terrible idea since the Genesis already had an add-on and it would be competing with their new system that was less than a year away. Not surprisingly, the 32X did terrible. The Saturn was first released in Japan in 1994. 1 year later, Sega decided that they would be releasing the Saturn to America immediately. This angered retailers because they were not informed ahead of time, which made some refuse to even sell the system at all. While there were some decent games for the Saturn, most famous being Virtua Fighter 2, the lack of a true 32-bit Sonic game stopped others from buying the console. Add this to the fact that the PlayStation and the N64 were coming, brought the Saturn to a quick death. By 1997, the Game Gear lost most of the market share due to the huge success of Pokemon on the Game Boy. Anger over Sega of Japan's decision, Tom left the company. The new CEO, Bernard Stoller, who was previously hired away from Sony in 1998, Bernard stopped development of the Saturn and focused on the Sega's new system, the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was also a complete opposite of the Saturn. It had simple hardware and was easy to program for. The system also allowed gamers to play online and surf the web. Bernard then went straight to work on getting software for his new system. The Sonic team started developing Sonic Adventures, and the development of Shenmue transferred from the Saturn to the Sega Dreamcast. They also bought Visual's concepts to create sports games that would compete with EA. While the Japanese launch was nothing spectacular, the US launch was a different story. The date was 9/9/99 when the Dreamcast came out with 17 different launch titles. At this time, it was the most successful game system launch in history. After that, Microsoft approached Sega in regards of putting Windows CE on the Dreamcast. After long talks with Microsoft, Bernard had the idea of selling Sega to them, but Japan said, of course, no. But later on, the Xbox was released shortly after. Even though great games kept coming out for the Dreamcast, they were just waiting for the inevitable release of the PlayStation 2. Add that to the fact that Sega was losing a lot of money, made them give up in 2001. So after that, the company Sammy bought Sega out for $1.1 billion, and now they make games for all the leading systems. So yeah, there it is for you folks. It's really, honestly, I thought it was kind of really unfortunate to see Sony had to go under because, honestly, they're always ahead of their time. I mean, the Dreamcast had pretty much PlayStation 2 or better graphics at the time, and it was actually really amazing. So this sucks to see that because of bad decisions by Japan and everything. Which, I don't know, people may have other theories, but I honestly think it's because Japan kept saying no to all these things that Sega just basically kind of went down, and basically why we'll never see the Dreamcast 2 or anything. So alright, I hope you folks enjoyed. Please be sure to rate, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you guys later.